Now, JavaScript is an object-oriented language, but if you are familiar with other mainstream languages such as C++ or C# or Java or Ruby, you may find it rather difficult to understand how its object orientation works. Now, if you're not familiar with object orientation, well, I'll give you a rundown of what you'll need to know to get started. Right, let's look at a simple object. A string is an object. Here I've got a string. Now, in this case, I've created a string by calling new string. Normally, of course, when you write a string, you just put it as a string literal, that is a string between quotes, as in hello world, but it's perfectly legal syntax to create it in this way, with new and then the name that you're going to create, the name of the type, which is string, and send it the date that you want to initialize it with, and that's hello world. That might not seem very useful with a string, but there are, of course, other object types that don't have these literal representations like a string. For example, a date. Now, a date can be created in the same way. I call new and then date, and then a pair of empty parentheses, and I assign the result to a variable, which is my date. And now I've got a date object, and a date object can have methods, that is, functions, that are wrapped up inside the object. And so here I call one of those methods getFullYear. Now let's look at this in action. Here's my string object being created, and I call upon it. Let's have a look at the code. The toUpperCase method, that's a function that's bound into string, to return the string as uppercase, and I use the length property, that's like a variable that lives inside the string, to return the length of the string, and they are displayed in this alert dialog. With the date object, I again call alert, and this time it displays the year, which is 2013, and let's look at the code, and that's been returned by the method, that's the function, that is wrapped up inside the date object. Now, here I've been using standard object types, but you can also create your own object types. Let's have a look at that. Here I've created an animal object. If you're familiar with other object-oriented languages, you'll be thinking, now where is the class for this? In many object-oriented languages, you create blueprints for objects. They're called classes, and then you create instances, that is the actual objects, which are based on the class definition. With JavaScript, you don't do that. You can just create a function. This is a function which I've happened to call by the name that I want to define my objects. And I've given it a capital letter. I don't have to, but that's quite normal to give these constructor functions, as they're called, a capital letter, so it's clearer to me that this has some special purpose. So this constructs an object of the animal type. How does it do that? It refers to the object itself using the keyword this, and it sets up properties. So I want each animal to have a name, so I do this dot name, and that is sort of like creating an internal variable called name, which I can access using dot notation, and I assign to that variable, that property as I'm going to call it, the name that was sent as a parameter. That's here called a name. And the next one, talk, that is actually a method. Now, how does that happen? What's say hello? Well, say hello is this function up here. It's just a normal standalone function, just the normal sorts of functions we've been creating before. And I happen to say here that I want this function to be assigned to something called talk. Again, I use this.talk to show that I mean it to live inside the object, the animal object. And so this .talk defines a method called talk, but when somebody calls the talk method, it is actually the say hello function that executes. Now let's look how I can use this in code. Down here I've got a function called createAnimal. I set up a variable, an animal, and again I use this syntax with new, the new keyword, to show that I want to create a new object. The object is based on animal, that's the constructor function that I've just explained, and I pass to it a string, that's the name that I want the animal to be known by. The string is Tiddles, and so that gets assigned to the name property, and then I call unanimal.talk talk, remember that is again the method that I defined up here. I said talk has been assigned the say hello function, so that's what gets executed when I call ananimal.talk, and I pass it some data, some arguments. In fact, I've even passed it the name property of the ananimal variable. And then I call ananimal.walk. Now, I haven't explained that. Before, when I wanted to put a method for animal, I defined a freestanding method called sayHello, and then I assigned it. And I assigned it to this talk, which I want to be the method name. With walk, I haven't defined a freestanding function. I've used this prototype syntax. So I've given the name of the sort of object, which is called animal, then dot prototype dot, and then the next part is the name of the method, and that's the name that I've just created. I want it to be called walk, then equals, and then function, and I've put in between the curly brackets the code that I want to execute when the walk method is called. So this is a kind of odd way of creating objects if you're familiar with classes, and it might take a little bit of thinking to get your head around this. I have to say I'm not very keen on the way that JavaScript does this sort of prototype method of creating objects, but it's a fairly lightweight way of creating objects, and JavaScript programmers inevitably get used to it if they're doing a lot of JavaScript programming. I wouldn't say that you'd necessarily want to create a big class hierarchy in your own programs, but you certainly want to know how to use objects. Now let's have a look. How do I do descent in class-based languages? It's normal to create base classes or superclasses and then have other classes which are descendants from them, and they inherit all the features of the base class and add on new features. How can I do that with this sort of object orientation which doesn't have classes? Well, here's an example. I've created this dog and I want it to inherit the features of animal. So what do I do? Well, this is my dog constructor. It takes a name as a parameter. When I want to assign the name value to the object, I execute this bit of code. Animal, that's the name of what I would call the superclass if this was a class-based system. Animal.call, that calls the animal constructor, and I pass it a reference to the current object. That's the this keyword. If there were no parameters defined by the animal constructor, that would be the end of it. But there is a parameter, so I put the parameter after a comma. That calls this constructor. It initializes the data, the property, name property of animal. And now my dog has access both to the properties and the methods defined by animal. And I've just added on one extra method, which I'm calling eat, and it references the eat food function, which again is a standalone function. And you can see it up here, and it just displays grunf, grunf, grunf when the dog is busy eating. Now, when you've created these object definitions, you may want to create several objects from them. So I've got an example here in the create dogs function. I've created two dogs. A dog equals new dog called Fido. Another dog equals new dog called Bonzo. I've now called a dog.talk. Remember that talk is defined in the ancestor, that is the animal object type, rather than in dog, so I can call that method because animal is treated as the dog's ancestor. And finally, I call the method that I defined specifically for the dog object, which is the eat method. Let's see this. So it displays, Grr, my name is Tiddles. I click OK. And then it says I'm taking a short stroll. Let's look at the code that actually caused that to execute. So here's the create animal function. It creates a new animal and it initializes it with Tiddles. That's by calling the constructor. And then it calls ananimal.talk. That displays Guru, followed by the animal name. Well, I've initialized the animal with Tiddles. And then it calls ananimal.walk, which is the other method which I defined up here, and that's why I got those two messages. Now let's look at create dogs. Remember, dogs are in a sense descending from animals because I've called the animal constructor from the dog constructor. Woof, my name is Fido. Howl, my name is Bonzo. I've got two dog objects. Those are the two dog objects displaying their names. And finally, grunf, 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 grunf. That's the method that I added on to dog, this.eat. So let's have a look at the code. So remember, that's the two dogs being created. There's the first dog being asked to talk, that its talk method, that it is derived from the animal object type. Then the second dog I again called talk. It's got some different information which it displays. And finally, I call the eat method, which I defined. So again, to remind you, and that's the results. So that's a very simple overview of how to create objects in JavaScript. I'll say again, I wouldn't personally want to try to create very elaborate object hierarchies in JavaScript. It's not as controllable, it's not as rigorously object-oriented as some mainstream application programming languages, but it's relatively simple to use, and you will be using objects, standard objects such as date, string, array, and so on, all the time in your JavaScript.